Terry and the twins stood over him while he packed. They hurried him along. They impounded his phone and his holopod, as well as his terminal, the twins sealing them up in a crate and carrying them off. "You'll have them back once Markov has taken a look at them," said Terry, "except for the phone. Can't I at least call Field and tell him I won't be in?" "No, I need some time to wrap up my affairs." "No, what about my family? They'll be worried." You're stalling," said Terry. "None of that other stuff is important. What's important is doing the job and doing it right. You keep stalling and I'll give Mr. Markov a call and we'll see how badly he wants you along. And then what, you'll kill me like you did Hammond?" Terry winced. "I resent the implication," he said. "I saw him die, sure, but I didn't have anything to do with it. Then it was Tim and Tom." "Not them either," said Terry. He looked at Ortman in a way that made the latter realize he was genuinely confused and strangely vulnerable. "What happened?" he asked. "We were just trying to question him, and he flipped out," said Terry. "I never seen anything quite like it. One moment he was running, and the next he was trying to kill us." He showed Altman an angry, awkward scar on his hand. "We didn't even have any weapons. Tanner had just sent us there to call to him." He rubbed his eyes with his knuckle, and then suddenly he took his knife and cut his own throat. "Never seen anyone cut quite that deep so quickly. Been dreaming about it ever since." Abruptly he straightened up, his face becoming close again. "I don't mind being blamed for what I've done, but don't blame me for what I haven't. Come on, get moving." They walked quickly to the Dredge Corp building, Terry holding on to his arm and hurrying him along. A few people looked at them seriously in the streets, but most just ignored them or deliberately looked the other way. The building now had a security fence around it made of welded wire mesh. The building itself had been razed to the ground and was in the process of being replaced by a structure formed of interlocking concrete and steel panels, more like a fortress than like a corporate building. "Some changes being made," said Altman. Terry nodded. "You don't know the half of it." He led him around behind the construction to a concrete pad. On it was a helicopter, blades already spinning. They hurried to it, and Altman climbed aboard. Ada was there, her face taut, drawn. He sat down next to her, and she clung to him. She isn't usually like that, he thought. She must be terrified. Almost immediately the helicopter took off. "I've been worried about you," he said, having to shout to be heard over the noise. "I thought they might have done something to you." "I was worried about you too," she said. "Are you okay?" He offered her a feeble smile. "No permanent damage, Michael." "Do you know where we're going?" "No," he said. "I'm afraid I don't." "I told you," she said. "This would all end badly," I said. "I told you to leave it alone, but you wouldn't listen." "It's never over yet," he said. He looked out the window. They had turned and were flying over the water now. We're already fairly far from land. He looked around the helicopter at the other passengers. Terry wasn't there either. He'd stayed behind or was up with the pilot. It contained 8 other scientists, all people he recognized by sight. Even if he didn't know them all, Field was one of them looking like he was sick to his stomach. Scud was there, as was Showalter, holding on to the roof straps. He moved over closer to them. "Where's Ramirez?" he shouted. "They didn't have him come," said Showalter. "What did they do with him?" Showalter shrugged. "Did they give you a choice?" asked Altman. "A what?" shouted Scud. "Why are they taking us?" "A choice? No," shouted Showalter. "We had to come." "Do you know where we're going?" shouted Scud. Altman shook his head. "I was going to ask you," he said. He clambered back to his bench. "They don't know," he said. "Nobody knows where we're going." They flew for roughly 3 hours. Direction, Altman thought, judging by the sun, was northwest or west-northwest, though he wasn't exactly sure. At some point he thought they turned south. How fast could a helicopter fly? 75 miles an hour? 100? It seemed like they were covering a lot of distance. "Maybe they're just planning to kill us," he thought. "Just put all of us on the same helicopter and engineer a crash." If so, he realized there was nothing he could do. He was already as good as dead. He sat on the bench, half deafened by the sound of the blades, his arms around Ada. It was his fault that she was there. He knew he was to blame. Across from him, Scud looked haggard, exhausted. Time slowed. The hum of the blades flew an octave, and the craft slowed noticeably. They all started looking out the windows. Below was a cloud of mist, almost perfectly symmetrical, clinging to the water. They started moving down toward it. Altman began to catch glimpses of something within the cloud. A flash here and there, a strut or a bit of metal. They came down slowly, the blades of the helicopter making the mist roll. He could see the top of a large glass dome, the glass blush wet and iridescent in the sudden light. They came very close, hovering maybe 10 meters above it, and he thought he could see a glimpse of faces inside. He could see on the metal struts and perforations of the glass, thousands of tiny jets, each of them releasing a fine spray of mist. Suddenly the jets stopped. The mist drifted around the structure for a moment and then slowly dissipated, revealing the dome and everything beneath it. It was a huge floating compound, hundreds of feet in diameter, made of a series of glass or plastic domes connected or overlapping like frogs' eggs. Much of it descended well below the surface of the water. Indeed, as much of the structure seemed to be below water as above, perhaps more. The top of the central dome, where the metal supports met, had a flat spot. Carefully, the pilot brought the helicopter down. He touched once, but with one strut off the flat spot, and they began to tilt. He went up again. It came down even slower, and this time managed it. The combined door opened from the outside. Two guards wearing dark military garb gestured to them to climb out. Altman expected the dome to sway up and down with the swells, but it was big enough that he hardly noticed anything. He climbed down onto the deck, then turned to help Ada down. The others soon followed. Together they made their way to a hatch and climbed down it. By descending a short ladder, they reached a platform just under the roof of the dome. The platform had a transparent shaft in the center of it, one side of it open. As he looked at it, a lift rose up into it. The guards gestured and herded them into it. The lift began to descend. It was only once they were off the platform and moving down on the slowly descending lift that Altman really got a sense of how big the dome was. They were probably 40 or 50 feet up. The large dome opened and nearly empty, the foggy light damping the glass walls and casting odd shadows. It was a hemisphere rather than a dome, a solid floor running along the bottom of it. Whether there was another reverse hemisphere below, there was no way to tell from here. Stacks of boxes and crates littered the floor along with partially assembled or perhaps partly disassembled machinery. Also military guards, lots of them, some of them standing at attention or employed in some small tasks, most of them walking or chatting idly, perhaps off duty. Here and there a man in a white coat stood directly, a group of them getting them to launch equipment around. At the bottom of the lift, two more guards stood waiting to meet them. Scud began to ask a question, but one of the guards interrupted him. No talking, he said. They kept the group there until everyone from the helicopter had made it down, and then led them across the floor of the dome. Groups of guards stopped talking as they approached, following them with their eyes. Above, Altman heard the sound of the helicopter taking off again. Immediately the nozzles began to spray, and the outside world dissolved in a cloud of mist. The ambient light in the dome dimmed, grew somber. Someone shouted a command, and banks of harsh fluorescent lying along the struts flickered on. The dome brightened with an intense spectic light, inflicting the skin of everyone around them with an unhealthy glow. They came to the edge of the large dome and passed through a sliding door, moving into a much smaller one, down through a pressure hatch into a passage running around the edge of a third dome and curving slowly downward. Halfway around the passage, Altman noticed the water lapping up against the side of the tunnel, growing higher with each step. There was a subtle change in the quality of the sound, as if everything here was lightly wrapped in cotton batting. He tapped the side of the corridor with his fingernail, heard only a dull, echo-less sound. Something with a pale, stretched eye veered out of the deeps and toward his hand, and then darted away again. A few steps later, the water rose all the way over their heads and closed over the top of the passage. They were completely below the surface. They left the corridor and came into a dome cast green from the reflection of the water. Fish and other animals swam around the floating compound, and here and there barnacles had begun to take hold at a distance, with the flanks of submarines connected by a series of cables to the floating compound pulling it very slowly along. "It's beautiful," said Ada. "It's terrifying," said Altman. The guard stuck the barrel of his gun firmly against Altman's rib, hard enough to hurt. "No talking," he said. They twisted to the bottom of the dome and took another lift down to a series of adjoined chambers, squish rooms. They passed from one to the next, the guards keeping them in a straight line and hustling them along. It felt to Altman like he was being led to his own execution. Here the water was deeper, darker. The rooms had more metal in them than glass. They were all lit by the same harsh fluorescent. The guards hustled them into another slightly descending corridor, this one ending in a pressure catch. Altman judged that they were back near the center of the lab, though well below the water line now. One of the guards opened it, ushered them through. The room inside resembled the bridge of a moon cruiser. It was a spherical chamber with a central elevated command chair. In all directions down a few steps were banks of controls, readouts, and hollow screens, and interrupted banks of windows ran along the upper half of the wall. The command chair was just enough above the rest of the lab to give an unimpeded view of the water in all directions. The chair spun around to reveal Markov. He looked down at them and smiled. Here in the environment, with his firm jaw and glittering eyes lit by the stark fluorescent, surrounded by water on all sides, he seemed like something monstrous pretending to be human. "Ah, you've arrived," he said without any warmth. "Welcome to your new home." It took a while, but they eventually got used to their new quarters. The lab was nicer than any he'd ever seen with, and was compromised only by his having to share it, just as he had in Chicxulub with Field. He saw this as a particular bit of sadism on Markov's part, and even wondered if he'd brought Field along only to irritate him. They were still 3 weeks away from getting to the center of the Chicxulub crater. The floating compound was towed forward very slowly, and sometimes, depending on weather conditions, had to be stopped. He'd intentionally thought the command center was the lowest point on the ship, but quickly realized that side corridors led to a tight sequence of chambers just below that. And below that finally was an even larger chamber, perhaps the largest chamber on the floating compound. It was carefully pressurized. It had a crane and a water opening and a very high ceiling. It was a last-minute addition to the lab. Altman learned from one of the other scientists, and had been built specifically to accommodate the object in the heart of the crater. Everywhere Altman went, he was amazed. The floating compound, obviously built for a specific but different purpose, was being quickly retrofitted with state-of-the-art equipment. Almost her hourly boats and helicopters arrived, bringing not only brand new equipment but also devices that were still in prototype phase. Expense was no object. Whatever was down there, they were prepared to spend whatever it took to get to it. They ate meals in shifts at the facility's cafeteria. The researchers stayed in the dormitories, rooms that, generally speaking, slept 6 through. There were a few exceptions. Altman and Ada, the only couple on board, were grudgingly given a converted storage closet as a bedroom. It was just big enough to hold their bed and a narrow filing cabinet that they stuffed with their clothes and made into a dresser. But they were still glad for the privacy. As Altman got to know the others, he had to admit that Markov had assembled a first-rate team. Not knowing exactly what the thing in the crater might be, he had his bases covered. There were a few scientists whose fields were so cutting-edge that there weren't names for them yet. There were geophysicists and astrophysicists, robotics experts, geologists, marine biologists, genetics, oceanologists, engineers of various stripes, a mining foreman, an ocean geographer, a seismologist, a volcanologist, a gravitationalist, a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, various doctors, a medic specialized in barotraumatism and decompression sickness, countless mechanics and technicians, a housekeeping and kitchen staff. There was even a linguist, and with Ada and anthropologists, a number of them were researchers who, although once quite famous, had vanished from the public eye years before. None of them would speak about what they'd been doing in the intervening years, and if pressed, spoke only of coming out of retirement. Retirement, my ass, Showalter whispered to him. Altman agreed. If they were here now, it was because they had been working covertly for military intelligence. In the meantime, they were given away by being the only ones who didn't seem surprised at the massive expense and effort going into expedition. They took it all for granted. What disturbed Altman even more were the number of military guards present and how actively they were trained. It was clear, or in any case seemed clear to Altman, that Markov had some notion that they had to be prepared for combat. There were 3 possibilities for this that Altman could come up with. One, the least disturbing to him, was that Markov was simply being a soldier himself, that he thought the military weren't needed, but that as long as they were here, they deserved to be put through their paces. The second, more disturbing, was that Markov expected someone to try to take the object away from them, that he was aware there were competing interests trying to get their hands on it. Or would be the third, and the worst of all, was perhaps Markov was expecting the object to fight back, which made Altman realize something he would have realized a long time before without having to altogether clear idea what it was Markov thought of the object at the center of the crater as a weapon. Maybe he wasn't intended the extraction for the betterment of mankind or the advancement of science. After all, Altman talked it over with Ada, told her his suspicious. Does that surprise you? She asked. Markov ruthless. He thinks of everything as a potential weapon, even people. He's a very dangerous man. 3, 4, 5, 6. He quickly found that a lot of places were out of bounds to him. There were certain areas, certain sets of laboratories both below and above the waterline that his keycard did not grant him access to. Sometimes he could get in following on the heels of a careless scientist or guard, but he was never allowed to remain long enough to get a good sense of what was happening. Other rooms were even more off limits, protected by round the clock guards. Field was in one of these, but when Altman asked him about it, he got nowhere less because Field was suspicious that because Field didn't see enough of the big picture to understand what was actually going on. After just a few days, he started to notice he was being watched. He began as a vague feeling, but grew stronger. He thought at first it was just paranoia, until Showalter noticed it as well. The guards regarded him in a different way than they did many of the other researchers, and whenever he'd spent some time alone in one of the corridors, often just ate together his thoughts, a guard suddenly showed up. Several of the technicians seemed to be paying him special attention. One man in particular, a man who always wore the same rumpled coverall, seemed always to be lingering just behind him. "What should I do?" he asked Ada. "What can you do?" She said. "If they want to watch you, they can watch you. There's nothing you can do about it."